Everybody like and subscribe, praise the bell icon. Story number 1.
It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. Just 3 friends, Jenna, Alyssa, and Chris, getting away from the city to unwind in a secluded rental cabin deep in the Pennsylvania woods. No neighbors for miles, no phone reception, no internet. Just the crunch of leaves, the whisper of the wind, and the promise of total disconnection. Perfect, they thought. They arrived Friday evening just before sundown. The cabin looked exactly like the listing photos, old but charming, nestled at the edge of dense forest. The air was cool, clean, and quiet. Almost too quiet. Inside, the place was rustic but cozy. 1 bedroom downstairs, a loft with 2 beds upstairs, a stone fireplace, and an old record player that added to the aesthetic. There was no cell service, but they found a guest book on the coffee table filled with entries from previous renters, most praising the solitude and beauty. But near the back, scribbled in shaky handwriting, 1 entry stood out. If you hear footsteps on the second night, don't open your eyes. Just wait until morning. They laughed it off at first, probably a joke. But something about the uneven handwriting and the way it was wedged between happy reviews unsettled Jenna. That night, they drank wine by the fireplace, told ghost stories, and went to bed a little buzzed, wrapped in blankets and surrounded by trees and silence. Around 3:17 a.m., Jenna woke to a soft thumping sound. She froze, listening. It was coming from outside the cabin, a slow, heavy tread circling the perimeter. Then it stopped right by her window. She didn't move, didn't breathe, just waited, heart racing, until the sound drifted away again. In the morning, she checked outside. No footprints, no signs of anything. She didn't mention it. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe the wine made her hear things. Saturday was uneventful. They hiked, took photos, cooked dinner, and joked about bears and serial killers. That night, they found an old stack of VHS tapes in a drawer. Most were unlabeled. Curious, they played one on the old TV. The footage was grainy and in black and white. It showed the same cabin from outside, but from a distance. The camera was unmoving, fixed on the front porch. Nothing happened for nearly 20 minutes. And then, just before the tape cut to static, a figure appeared, barefoot in a long coat, standing still watching the door. Chris immediately turned the TV off. "Someone's messing with us," he said. They searched the cabin for more tapes, hidden cameras, anything, but they found nothing. That night, they all agreed to sleep downstairs together, safety in numbers. At 3:17 a.m. again, the thumping started. This time, it was inside. Footsteps slowly moved across the loft above them, deliberate and steady, as if someone were pacing. But the loft was empty. They had all come downstairs. Jenna's breath caught in her throat. Alyssa reached for her phone, but of course, no signal. Chris grabbed the fireplace poker and stood beneath the loft, staring up. The footsteps stopped. Then something dragged across the floor, a soft scrape like wood sliding on wood. They waited, paralyzed, until it started again, this time descending the stairs. They ran, bolted out the front door barefoot into the cold night, without flashlights, jackets, or shoes. They didn't stop running until they hit the dirt road where their car was parked. Chris fumbled with the keys, hands shaking, finally getting the doors open. As they sped away, Jenna looked back. In the rearview mirror, she saw the figure again, barefoot, coat too long, standing in the driveway, that head tilted, watching them disappear into the dark. They reported it to the police the next day from a diner in the next town. An officer went out to investigate and found the cabin untouched, door locked, no signs of forced entry, no footprints. But in the guest book, the newest entry was written in the same shaky handwriting they had seen before. It read, "You opened your eyes."
Story number 2.
It was supposed to be a simple weekend escape. Mark and Lisa had been dating for 6 months, and after a particularly stressful few weeks at work, they decided to book a secluded cabin in the Appalachian Mountains. No distractions, no technology, just the 2 of them, a bottle of wine, and the quiet serenity of the forest. The cabin was tucked away on a small private plot of land, far from the nearest town or even other cabins. It seemed like the perfect getaway. They arrived just as the sun was beginning to set, casting an eerie orange glow over the trees. The cabin itself was old but charming. 2 stories, a wraparound porch, and a large stone fireplace inside. The owners had left a note on the kitchen counter welcoming them, and a small stack of firewood sat neatly by the door. Mark and Lisa were excited to settle in, but as the light faded and the forest grew darker, a strange sense of unease began to settle over them. That night, after dinner and a couple of glasses of wine, they decided to sit on the porch and watch the stars. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Just the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Lisa, always the more nervous of the two, pointed it out. "It's too still," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Mark laughed it off. "It's just how the mountains are. Relax." But Lisa couldn't shake the feeling. As the darkness deepened, she started hearing faint footsteps in the trees just beyond the cabin, though she couldn't see anyone. She tried to ignore it, but the sounds continued, slow, deliberate steps, always just out of sight. Around 11 p.m., Lisa convinced Mark to head inside. The sounds of footsteps outside had stopped, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They locked the door and sat by the fire, talking quietly. But then the noise came again. It was soft, like someone walking on gravel, just beyond the cabin's windows. Mark stood up, his face taut with irritation. "Seriously, this is getting annoying." "I'll go check it out." Lisa grabbed his arm. "Don't go out there. It's too late. Just forget it." But Mark shrugged her off and grabbed a flashlight. He stepped out onto the porch and began shining the light around the perimeter of the cabin, but saw nothing. The footsteps had stopped as soon as he opened the door, and the silence returned. Mark stood there for a moment, shining the flashlight into the trees, listening. Then he saw something, a figure in the distance, just beyond the tree line. It was too far to make out clearly, but the shape seemed to be standing still, staring at him. Mark called out to it, but there was no answer. Then the figure moved, slowly, deliberately, towards him. Mark's heart began to race. He stepped back onto the porch, shutting the door behind him, but the figure didn't stop. It kept walking, taking deliberate steps towards the cabin, never once breaking its slow, steady pace. Lisa, frightened now, watched him through the window, her breath catching in her throat. "Mark, get inside!" But Mark didn't move. He stood frozen, staring at the figure that now seemed closer, much closer than before, its movements unnaturally slow. The flashlight in his hand flickered, and then the beam went out completely. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness. Mark's voice broke the silence, barely a whisper. "Lisa, it's not a person." Lisa's heart stopped. She couldn't see him anymore. Only darkness. And the figure, still standing in the woods, not moving, just watching. Terrified, Lisa bolted to the door, yanking it open, but Mark was already inside. His face was pale, his eyes wide. He slammed the door behind him, locking it. "We need to leave. Now," Mark said, his voice strained. Lisa grabbed her coat, and the two rushed to the car. But when they stepped outside, the figure was gone, disappeared into the trees as if it had never been there at all. The air was heavy, thick with something they couldn't explain. The drive down the winding mountain roads was filled with silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of the car's old radio. The woods surrounding them were dense, and even with the headlights, the road felt endless, as though the forest itself were pressing in on them. And then, just as they passed a particularly dark stretch of trees, Mark slammed on the brakes. There, standing on the side of the road, was the same figure, the same slow, deliberate movements. It didn't look at them. It didn't react. It just stood there, staring into the woods. The headlights bathed it in a harsh light, but it remained unmoving. Mark didn't need to say anything. He gunned the engine, swerving around the figure, and they didn't stop until they reached the nearest town, where they stayed the night in a hotel. The next morning, they called the cabin owner to tell them about the incident. The owner sounded puzzled, but polite. When asked if anyone else had reported strange sightings, the owner hesitated. "Well, we've had guests mention things before. Strange figures in the woods, unexplainable noises, the usual stuff. But I'll tell you this," the owner said, lowering his voice. "There's a reason the cabin is so cheap. People who stay there often leave, but they never stay gone." The line went dead.
Story number 3.
It was supposed to be a peaceful trip, a quiet getaway to the coast with friends. Laura, Ben, and Tim had been looking forward to the weekend for weeks. They rented a small, isolated house right on the edge of a rocky beach, with nothing but miles of cliffs and the relentless waves crashing below. It was the kind of place that promised relaxation. No neighbors, no distractions, just the sound of the ocean. They arrived on Friday evening, just as the sun was setting. The house was older, but charming. It had a certain creaky charm, with old wooden beams and weathered windows that overlooked the beach. The air smelled of salt and seaweed, and the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks was hypnotic. After unpacking, they made a quick dinner and opened a few beers. They ate on the porch, watching the last of the sun disappear beneath the horizon. The quietness of the place was almost oppressive, but it didn't seem to bother any of them. By 9 p.m., the last traces of daylight were gone, and the only light came from the dim porch lamp and the moon glinting off the water. That night, the three friends sat around the fireplace in the living room. They were playing cards, laughing, and trying to shake off the odd feeling that had started creeping in. Laura was the first to mention it. "Doesn't it feel like something's off about this place?" she asked, half joking. "I mean, it's beautiful, but it feels a little too quiet." Ben laughed. "You're just imagining things. It's just the isolation, that's all." But it didn't help. Laura's unease lingered, growing stronger. The house creaked and groaned in ways that didn't seem natural. She kept hearing soft footsteps upstairs, a muffled tapping noise that sounded like someone walking around in the room above them. Tim went up to check, but the room was empty. Nothing was out of place. Still, the sounds continued, and each time they grew more persistent. By the time they decided to go to bed, it was well past midnight. They locked up and turned off the lights, the house descending into an eerie silence. Laura was the first to fall asleep, but she woke sometime later, drenched in sweat. The air had turned unnaturally cold, and the silence outside was now broken by soft whispers. She couldn't make out the words, but the sound was unmistakable. Voices, low and rasping, coming from the darkened hallway outside her room. The whispers grew louder, and she could feel a presence near the door. Her heart raced as she pulled the blanket tighter around herself, trying to pretend it wasn't happening. She must have imagined it. It was probably just the wind, right? But then, the door creaked open. Laura's eyes went wide. She didn't dare move. Slowly, a shadow crossed the threshold, tall and formless, its shape distorted by the darkness. She wanted to scream, to shout for Ben or Tim, but her throat was paralyzed with fear. The shadow hovered for a moment before it disappeared, as though it had never been there. Morning came, and Laura told Ben and Tim about the strange experience. They dismissed it as a nightmare, but Laura wasn't so sure. There was something unsettling about the house, something she couldn't explain. Tim suggested they go for a walk along the beach to clear their minds. The three of them left the house, walking down the rocky path to the shoreline. The beach was empty, save for the occasional seagull circling overhead. But as they walked along the edge of the water, something caught Laura's eye, footprints in the sand. But the strange part was that they weren't their own. There were 3 sets of footprints, and they led from the water up to the edge of the cliffs where the rocks jutted out over the ocean. And then, just as they were about to comment on it, the wind picked up suddenly, whipping through the air and forcing them to turn back. That night, things took a darker turn. The whispers came again, louder this time. They sounded like voices in a language Laura couldn't understand, and the footsteps, now unmistakable, began to march through the house, pacing back and forth just outside their bedroom doors. Tim finally got up to check the entire house, but once again, it was empty. By the time the 3rd night rolled around, none of them could sleep. Each night seemed to grow worse, heavier. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. But it wasn't just that. Something more terrifying was happening. Laura could feel a presence in the room with them, a cold, malevolent force that seemed to watch them as they slept. She felt it breathing on the back of her neck, even though she knew she was alone in bed. That night, at the stroke of 2 a.m., everything changed. The door to their bedroom flung open, and this time it wasn't a shadow that stood there. It was a figure, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. It didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there watching them. The only sound was the raspy breath it took, each inhale and exhale a sound that chilled them to the bone. Tim reached for the lamp beside the bed, but the light flickered and died as soon as his hand touched it. Then, with a sickeningly slow movement, the figure began to walk toward them. Frozen in terror, they couldn't move. It was as though they were paralyzed, their bodies unable to respond to the primal urge to run. As it drew closer, the room grew colder, so cold they could see their breath. It stopped at the foot of the bed, its long, spindly fingers reaching out. But just as it was about to touch them, the house let out a loud creak, followed by a violent rumble. The lights flickered on for a brief second, revealing the figure's face, twisted in a grotesque grin. And then, just like that, it was gone. The room was quiet once more. They didn't wait to see what would happen next. At the first light of dawn, they packed their things and left. None of them spoke of what happened until they were miles away, speeding down the winding road. They called the property owner later, demanding to know the history of the house. The owner hesitated before answering. That house has always had a way of attracting visitors, and they don't leave. They never leave. The line went dead, and they never went back.
Story number 4.
It was supposed to be an unforgettable weekend for Mark, his girlfriend Emily, and their two closest friends, Sarah and Jack. They had rented a cabin deep in the woods of Oregon, far from civilization. The cabin was rustic, a 2-story affair with large windows that looked out into the dense forest. The pictures had made it seem perfect, quaint, peaceful, and isolated. A getaway from their busy lives. They arrived on Friday evening, just as dusk was settling over the trees. The air was crisp and smelled like pine. The 4 of them unloaded their bags, grabbed some wine, and began settling in. They spent the evening unpacking and cooking, the occasional crackle from the fireplace filling the quiet air. As night fully descended, the forest outside seemed to become darker and denser. A sharp chill filled the air, and the wind picked up, rustling the trees like whispers on the wind. But it wasn't until they were sitting around the fire that the first strange thing happened. Mark was telling a story when the front door of the cabin suddenly creaked open. The wind? Emily thought, but the door wasn't supposed to be unlocked, and they hadn't heard anyone near it. Mark stood up to investigate, but as he reached for the door, it slammed shut hard. No wind, no one outside, just a gust of cold air rushing past them. They brushed it off, probably just a draft. But as the night wore on, things started to feel off. They'd hear strange tapping sounds coming from the walls, like nails scraping against wood. Sarah swore she saw a figure in the trees outside, but when Mark went out to check, there was nothing there. By midnight, they were all unnerved, but they figured it was just nerves. They decided to go to bed. But as Mark and Emily lay in their room, they heard something else, a slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor of the cabin above them. They froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. They tried to dismiss it, but the sound grew louder, closer. Mark grabbed a flashlight, his hand trembling. He went upstairs to check, but when he reached the top, the house was eerily silent. No one was there. The bedroom door to the second floor was wide open, and the floorboards in the hall were untouched. But when he turned to go back downstairs, something made him stop. A figure, dark and formless, stood in the hallway behind him. It didn't move, just stared at him with hollow, empty eyes. His breath caught in his throat. He could feel a cold, malevolent energy radiating from it, like it was something not quite human. "Mark?" Emily's voice echoed from downstairs, breaking the stillness. The figure disappeared the moment she called his name. He ran down, shaking. "There's something up there, something wrong with this place." The others were already awake by the time he returned, their faces pale and drawn. They had heard the sounds too, the dragging, the whispers, the footsteps above them when no one was there. The group decided they wouldn't stay another night, but when they tried to leave, something stopped them. The door wouldn't budge. The lock had jammed, and the windows refused to open, no matter how hard they tried. In the dead of night, the cabin felt alive with a strange, oppressive energy. Time moved differently there. The walls seemed to breathe, and the dark corners of the room seemed to stretch with shadows that didn't belong. Then came the voices. Low, guttural whispers, the kind that didn't sound like they came from a living being. They circled around them, pushing them toward the center of the room. Then came the scratching at the windows, at the door, across the floor. It was as if something was trying to get inside. No, something was already inside, and it was getting closer. Emily screamed when she saw it. A pale hand, skeletal and clawed, creeping out from beneath the door to the basement. It was slow, deliberate, like it had been waiting for them. The door to the basement swung open by itself, and the shadowy figure from upstairs emerged again, this time more defined, its body hunched and twisted, its arms too long for its frame. With a desperate cry, Mark rushed forward and threw open the door, only to find that there was nothing there. Nothing but the blackness of the stairwell. But when he turned back, the others were gone. Panicking, he searched the cabin, calling their names, but no one responded, only the whispers, the scratching, the dragging sound, moving through the hallways. It was then that he realized something terrifying. He was alone. They were gone, vanished without a trace, and whatever was in the house was still watching him. He ran to the door again, pounding on it with all his strength, but it wouldn't open. The house seemed to shift around him, the walls pressing in, the windows now covered with thick, impenetrable darkness. He screamed again, his mind unraveling when the whispers became clearer. More than just whispers now, words, but not in any language he understood. Suddenly, everything went silent. And then, in the silence, the door to the basement creaked open once again. The last thing Mark saw before the lights flickered and went out was the figure standing at the top of the stairs, its long, outstretched arms reaching toward him, pulling him toward the darkness below. The next morning, a search team arrived to find the cabin. They searched every room, every inch of the property, but there was no sign of Mark, Emily, Sarah, or Jack. The house was exactly as it had been when they left, untouched and still. But when the team checked the basement, they found something strange, a small tattered journal on the floor, its pages yellowed with age. The last entry read, "They never leave. The house keeps them. I am next." And in the margins, scribbled frantically, were the words, "It waits."